Melbourne, Australia currently has the largest tram system in the world, but it was not always so. Not long ago, the tram capital of the world was St. Petersburg, Russia, with over 300 kilometers of double track. And it was not just a legacy of the famous Soviet pursuit to make the biggest things in the world. This city's relationship with the tram is much deeper. The tram has literally saved lives during the most cruel period of its history, the siege, which lasted a total of 872 days. German troops attacked the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. They advanced quickly to the north, and by the beginning of autumn, they had severed the last road to Leningrad, the Soviet name of St. Petersburg, the second largest city in Russia, which back then had a population of more than 3 million people. Hitler's plan was to put the former capital of the Russian Empire under siege and bombardment, starving its population to death, and then wiping it from the face of the earth through demolition. From early September, air raids became part of the city's daily routine and lasted until 1944. The public transportation system continued to work, although it had to adapt to wartime. Stops were moved near safe covers, as enemy aircraft aimed specifically at gatherings of people. Despite the lack of drivers, many of whom went to war, tram trains were disengaged into single cars, which were harder to hit from above. Night track maintenance was almost suspended, as welding sparks would light up the city and make it visible for bombing. To dim the streets in the evening, tram interiors were illuminated with faint blue lamps wrapped in cases that prevented the light from going sideways and escaping through the windows. Every night the city was plunged into complete darkness, and to avoid accidents, cars had to go very slowly. Low speed also turned out to be the only working solution for another blackout problem, the arcing of current collectors. Catenary hit by projectiles made for dangerous cobwebs of long hanging wires, but even unexploded bombs caused a lot of trouble. We heard a story that when 5 shells fell in close proximity to tram tracks during the rush hour and luckily failed to explode, the driver dropped off all the passengers, put the tram at the slowest controlled speed, and jumped off too, allowing the car to proceed through the dangerous section unmanned, while people bypassed it using the adjacent street. These were the practices of running a tram under constant air raids. But most of the people in the besieged Leningrad did not die because of the bombing. With the onset of cold weather, in a city cut off from the outside world, the famine began. The famine in the besieged Leningrad is one of the greatest tragedies of World War II, which resulted in the death of more than 600,000 civilians. During its harshest period, the winter of 1941 to 1942, the rations to which a person was entitled was only 125 grams of bread. The least component of bread was flour. They had to add press cake, cellulose, bran, chaff. People had to eat halm, pine needles, animal glue. Laboratories tried to extract nutritional components from various industrial oils. In these horrific conditions, a functioning public transportation system made an invaluable contribution to supporting the life of the city. It was calculated that riding a tram saved each passenger about 400 kilocalories per day in comparison to walking. That's almost half of the ration to which a factory worker was entitled. But the worst began on the night of December 8, 1941. Due to a heavy snowfall, it was decided to leave a few cars circulating overnight in order to prevent the tracks from needing sweeping. The electricity supply was unstable, and trams had to stop and resume their movement with great difficulty through the snow that meanwhile had time to freeze. The fight with the weather lasted all night, and by morning, the power was completely cut off. Ales Adamovich and Daniel Granin wrote in their Book of Siege, "The city became pedestrian. Distances were now measured not in time, as before, but in steps, sometimes in the number of steps." Sofia Savolskaya, a teacher, remembers, "The mercury in the thermometer is approaching minus 40 degrees. Underfoot, there's either the ice from spilled water, which had to be carried in buckets, or huge drifts of snow, which there was no one to clean. Ice-covered trams stand like enchanted monsters in a fairy tale dream. The dangling wires hang in long white threads. In the mornings, you see strings of sledges with the dead pressed in white shrouds. You go, and the road stretches, and it seems it will never end. The city's widespread tram and trolleybus networks were its vital arteries since the first days of the war, as almost all the vehicles were mobilized for operating on the battlefront. The remaining could not be used due to a shortage of gasoline. Hastily converted freight trams transported wounded soldiers over temporary laid rails to the hospital yards and hauled flour to the bakeries. The tram men managed to collect and bake grains of flour that spilled on the floor of the tram. When the system became de-energized, exhausted people had to transport food on sleds. Trams and trolleybuses stood motionless on city streets, gradually turning into snowdrifts. By the end of December, it became possible to supply the city with food using an ice road across Ladoga Lake. They named this extremely dangerous 30-kilometer-long path the Road of Life. It allowed food rations to double, which was still highly insufficient. Emaciated by extreme malnutrition, tram men worked no matter what, cleaning the snow from the tracks and resting after each swing of a shovel. During the worst winter in its history, the city became heavily littered with snow and filth, which created the threat of an epidemic when the snow and ice started melting in the spring. Understanding the danger, the city committee of the Communist Party ordered the freight tram's traffic to resume with the aim of taking the snow and filth out of the city. To the big surprise of everyone, the cars, which had spent 3 months standing ice-covered on the street, turned out to be mostly operational. They were even able to help their younger brothers, trolleybuses, who also spent that horrible winter on the streets. With the assistance of only one fully fueled truck, which, let's remember, was a very scarce resource, each trolleybus was pulled to a nearby tram. Then one trolley was connected to the tram's current collector, and the other to the tram's body. In this way, a trolleybus was able to use the tram's energy, and side by side, they were able to get back to the depot. Meanwhile, one of the power plants repaired one more of its boilers. Now the city had enough energy to restore the passenger traffic of trams. The spring of '42 was made not by swallows, but by trams. April 15th was a day of great revival for the whole city. Tired, exhausted people greeted the newly returned trams with tears of joy. Worn out, doorless cars with windows boarded up with plywood gave people hope for victory. They all saw those dangling wires twisted in a bundle, those bombed, snow-covered trams. With weak, trembling hands, the tram men of Leningrad accomplished the real feat. They lifted up the catenary and let those simple, ingenuous trams circulate again. We were weak. We were weak too, but we ran after the tram on our flimsy, swollen feet, and we shouted, "Ring once more! Ring once more!" That was a joy that this tram brought us. On the other side of the front, a completely different mood reigned. German artilleryman Falkenhorst remembers how on the night of April 15th, he saw weird blue sparkles running through the clouds over Leningrad. "What is this, Kurt?" he asked his companion. "Are the Russians trying to use their new secret weapon?" Kurt looked towards the city for a long time and grumbled. Falkenhorst, they launched a tram." They launched a tram? The Russians in Leningrad at the 7th month of the siege? What have we been freezing here all winter for? What about the forest of crosses that grew in our cemeteries? Why were we shouting about the inevitable death of city residents, about our victory if they launched a tram? There was a year left before the siege was penetrated. There were 2 years left before the German troops were pushed away from the city and the siege ended. There were more than 3 long years left before the final destruction of the Nazi regime. But even then, the tram of Leningrad gave people the feeling that victory was inevitable, and it has never stopped working again since then.